In Hollywood, every star needs protection. Not real protection, of course. God forbid, we mean image protection. Introducing the Hollywood Float Plan, the premium crisis management package for celebrities, studios, and rich people with a very inconvenient night on the water. Got broken glass? No problem. Got screaming witnesses? We can blur that out. Got a timeline that makes absolutely no damn sense? Our experts will stretch it, fold it, and dress it up in a tuxedo till it looks like a tragic accident. With the Hollywood Float Plan, you get immediate narrative control. Before the body's even cold, we've already got 3 friendly quotes, 2 soft focus headlines, and 1 polished public statement about deep sorrow. Witness reduction technology. Not reduction like that. Relax. We just make everybody sound confused, emotional, unreliable, or drunk. Real classy stuff. Studio-grade reputation shielding. Why investigate when you can protect the brand? If there's a movie in production, a television career on the line, or a beloved leading man involved, we go to work like greased lightning. Luxury blame transfer. Bruises, tragic confusion. Delays, miscommunication. Questions, conspiracy theories. Dead woman? Sad, unfortunate, very complicated. And for a limited time, upgrade to the Gilded Silence Platinum package, featuring a friendly press corps, selective memory, missing urgency, and that old-fashioned Hollywood magic where powerful men walk away clean while everybody else gets buried under the credits. So remember, when the night goes wrong, don't reach for the truth. Reach for the Hollywood Float Plan. Because in this town, image floats. Even when justice sinks. The Hollywood Float Plan. Turning scandal into sympathy since the Golden Age. Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation contains commentary, historical discussion, analysis, speculation, internet anthropology, organized crime history, old Hollywood chaos, and enough paranoia to make a guy in a trench coat stare out a motel window for 6 straight hours. Some portions of this story involve theories, allegations, rumors, interpretations, and underworld speculations surrounding old Hollywood, organized crime, and the strange machinery operating behind the curtains of power. This is not a court filing. This is not a federal indictment. This is not Bambi Palermo kicking in a door with a search warrant and yelling, "Nobody move, you animals!" Some claims discussed here remain disputed, unproven, or heavily debated. Because old Hollywood history occasionally stops behaving like reality and starts behaving like a screenwriter got locked in a basement with espresso and conspiracy magazines. And somehow history still ends up sounding crazier than fiction. So put on the coffee. Lock the doors. Check the windows. And if a mysterious guy in a suit starts asking questions, maybe don't answer. Let's get into it.
Pizzaverse Studios presents Palermo Productions Original Documentary The Hollywood Vault, The Strange Death of Susan Kitt. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. Produced by Pizzaverse Studios and Palermo Productions. Edited somewhere in Jersey after midnight. A glamorous Hollywood actress. A discarded operative. A woman allegedly standing at the crossroads of celebrity, power, organized crime, and secrets worth more than money. And decades later, a blood-soaked mansion. A steel barbell. A dead actress. And one question hanging over everything. Was this a tragic family catastrophe? Or did somebody quietly close an account that knew too much? Because according to one darker theory, Susan Kitt wasn't simply another forgotten Hollywood casualty. She may have become something much more dangerous. A vault. And in certain worlds, vaults eventually get emptied, then destroyed. The girl before Hollywood. Before there was Susan Kitt, before the bright lights, before the movie posters, before the whispered allegations of underworld connections and shadow deals, there was Harriet Pearl Shapiro. And if there is one thing history teaches over and over again, it's this. The people who become the easiest to control later in life usually learn survival very early. Born in 1927 in Boston, Massachusetts, Harriet entered a world that offered very little softness and even less stability. Long before cameras, long before Hollywood, long before anyone knew her name, she was surviving. According to accounts surrounding her early years, Harriet passed through multiple foster homes during childhood. And foster care during that era wasn't the polished public image people imagine today. This wasn't inspirational television music. This wasn't heartwarming movie material. This was survival. Cold rules, unpredictable adults, temporary rooms, temporary families, temporary safety. For a child moving through that world, stability wasn't something you possessed. It was something you chased. And children become remarkably good at adaptation when adaptation becomes the difference between comfort and fear. Harriet reportedly learned how to read rooms before she learned how to trust them. She learned to study expressions, learn moods, predict anger, measure tension. Because when you're young and powerless, survival sometimes means becoming whatever the people around you need you to be. Funny, quiet, invisible, agreeable, anything, whatever worked, whatever kept the peace, whatever kept the roof over your head another night. And maybe that's where the first performance began, not on a movie set, not beneath bright studio lights, not in front of cameras, right there, in childhood. Because acting is really just controlled transformation. And Harriet had already spent years doing exactly that. Only for her, there were no directors yelling, "Cut," no applause, no audience, just survival. As the years moved forward, one thing allegedly became stronger, a profound need to be seen, not looked at, seen, because there's a difference. People who spend childhood feeling invisible sometimes spend adulthood trying to become unforgettable. And Hollywood has always been very good at finding people carrying that particular wound, because Hollywood doesn't just sell fame, it sells reinvention. It offers a bargain, becomes someone else, and maybe the pain stays behind. So Harriet moved east, eventually finding work in television and entertainment circles before making her way toward California. And somewhere along the journey, Harriet Pearl Shapiro slowly disappeared, and Susan Kitt arrived, a new name, a new face, a new identity, a new performance. Because old Hollywood loved transformation stories, it specialized in them. Studios changed names, changed appearances, changed accents, changed histories. Sometimes they changed people completely. And Susan Kitt projected something different. She wasn't the standard blonde bombshell archetype Hollywood mass-produced. She carried darker energy, sharp features, intensity, an almost feral screen presence. Something harder to categorize, something harder to control. And for a little while it worked. But here's the thing history keeps doing. The past usually sends the bill eventually. And the little girl who learned survival in unstable places was heading toward an industry filled with powerful men, hidden agendas, and people who knew exactly how to spot vulnerability. And whether she realized it or not, the foundations of the trap had already been built. She just hadn't walked into it yet. The B-movie queen. Hollywood has always sold a beautiful lie. Not just to audiences, to actors, to dreamers, to every kid stepping off a bus with one suitcase and a head full of impossible ideas. The promise always sounds the same. Come here. Reinvent yourself. Become somebody. And for a brief moment, Susan Kitt looked like proof that the machine worked. Harriet Pearl Shapiro was gone. In her place stood Susan Kitt, dark-haired, sharp-featured, intense, and impossible to ignore. Because she didn't fit the assembly line. Old Hollywood loved categories. Studios liked clean labels. The blonde bombshell. The girl next door. The elegant socialite. The sweet innocent. Simple. Safe. Marketable. Susan wasn't any of those things. She projected something harder. A kind of dangerous energy. Not polished. Not delicate. Not predictable. She carried an edge that made people look twice. And independent filmmakers immediately noticed it. Because the B-movie world operated differently from the major studios. The big studios wanted formulas. The drive-in circuit wanted spectacle. Monsters. Crime. Danger. Women who looked like trouble. And Susan Kitt looked like trouble. In the late 1950s, she became a familiar face in low-budget cult pictures and exploitation films. She worked constantly. Movie after movie. Set after set. Long hours. Small budgets. Fast productions. No luxury. No prestige. Just motion. Always motion. She starred in films like The Wasp Woman and Sorority Girl. Drive-ins across America projected her image onto giant outdoor screens. Teenagers packed parking lots. Projectors hummed in the dark. And for a while, Susan Kitt had become exactly what Harriet once wanted seen. Recognized. Remembered. And here's where Hollywood does the thing Hollywood always does. It creates an illusion. Because from a distance, fame looks enormous. Movie posters, photographs, premieres, magazine spreads. People assume success means safety. But Hollywood has always had a nasty habit. Sometimes people become famous before they become financially secure. And B-movies paid working wages, not empire money, not mansion money, not retire at 40 and buy a yacht money. But Susan reportedly wanted the image. The appearance, the performance, expensive clothes, lavish parties, status, success. Because if people saw glamour, maybe nobody would see insecurity. If people saw confidence, maybe nobody would see fear. And if people saw a star, maybe Harriet Pearl Shapiro disappeared forever. Only the math eventually catches up. Always. The cameras stop rolling, the lights shut off, the party ends. And eventually somebody starts asking, who's paying for all this? Because image has a cost, and maintaining image costs even more. And somewhere beneath the makeup, publicity photos, and bright Hollywood lights, the old survival instincts were still sitting there. The same girl from the foster homes, still adapting, still performing, still trying to build stability from whatever pieces she could find. Only now the stakes were bigger, the bills were larger, and the people waiting in the shadows weren't casting directors anymore. Because Hollywood attracts dreamers, but it also attracts predators. And Susan Kitt was about to discover the difference. The rise looked glamorous. The fall was already waiting backstage. Debt, desperation, and shadow men. Hollywood has a funny way of hiding disaster. The photographs always look beautiful. The smiles always look real. The parties always look endless. And meanwhile, somewhere behind the camera, somebody's life is quietly coming apart. Because image is expensive. And maintaining an image you cannot afford, that becomes a full-time job. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Susan Kitt had become recognizable. Not superstar recognizable. Not shut down the streets and call the press recognizable. But recognizable enough. Drive-in audiences knew her face. Directors knew her name. Producers knew she could work. And for a little while, that looked like success. From the outside. Inside? Different story. Because B-movie money wasn't A-list money. The public sees fame and assumes fortune. History says otherwise. There have always been actors living glamorous lives in public while privately performing financial CPR every month. And according to the darker interpretation of Susan's story, she wanted the appearance of enormous success. Not because she was selfish. Not because she was arrogant. Because insecurity can become a hunger. Especially for somebody who spent childhood chasing stability. Because once you've lived without security, sometimes you become terrified of losing the illusion of it. So she bought expensive clothing, hosted parties, maintained appearances, built a version of success large enough to convince everyone around her and maybe convince herself. But eventually, reality enters the room carrying a baseball bat. The money slowed, the bills didn't, and suddenly Hollywood started becoming less glamorous and more mathematical. Expenses, debt, payments, deadlines, the nightmare word, interest. Now, in a perfect world, somebody in trouble goes to a bank, gets help, signs paperwork, problem solved. But old Hollywood wasn't a perfect world, and actresses with inconsistent incomes were often viewed as risk. Studios controlled careers, public image mattered, scandal mattered, instability mattered. So according to theories surrounding Susan's life, she started moving toward another financial ecosystem. The shadows, not banks, not accountants, not institutions, men. Quiet men, men who knew people, men who loaned money, men who always smiled a little too much. And history has repeatedly demonstrated one universal law. The people offering easy money rarely operate out of kindness. Because shadow money arrives fast, but collecting it becomes the problem, especially when those loans begin multiplying, interest stacking on top of interest, payments building, pressure increasing, and eventually the numbers become impossible. That's the thing about debt. People imagine chains, handcuffs, violence. Sometimes debt starts with a handshake. Then suddenly you wake up and realize somebody else owns the room. According to the darker interpretation of events, Susan believed she could outwork the problem, act harder, work more films, stay moving, stay ahead. Perform one more role, make one more appearance, keep spinning plates. Because performers are trained to believe the next job fixes everything. The next break, the next check, the next opportunity, the next miracle. But life occasionally ignores the script. And then came Timothy. And according to this interpretation of the story, the moment Timothy entered Susan's life, the trap stopped tightening. Because now it had shut completely. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching. Someone who understood vulnerability. Someone who understood leverage. Someone who understood that desperate people become controllable people. And according to one theory, Susan Kitt had just become very valuable. Not as an actress, not as a celebrity, as an asset. Timothy and the trap. Sometimes life doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it kicks the damn door off the hinges. And according to the darker interpretation surrounding Susan Kitt's story, Timothy's birth changed everything. Because up until this point, Susan was drowning. Debt. Pressure. Fear. Hollywood appearances. Shadow lenders. Bills stacked on top of bills. But drowning and desperation are not always the same thing. Desperate arrives when somebody else is involved. Especially your child. Timothy Roman entered Susan's world carrying challenges no parent is prepared to hear. He was reportedly born with Russell Silver syndrome, a rare condition associated with severe growth complications and complex medical needs. And suddenly the math changed. This wasn't rent money anymore. This wasn't clothing. This wasn't Hollywood image maintenance. This was doctors, specialists, treatments, appointments, medical interventions. And according to accounts and theories surrounding the case, the costs became overwhelming, astronomical, crushing. The kind of numbers that make people stare at walls at 3 in the morning, wondering how they're supposed to survive tomorrow. Because a parent can carry a lot. Fear. Exhaustion. Embarrassment. Failure. But watching your child suffer? That hits different. And according to the narrative surrounding Susan's life, isolation started settling in. Because Hollywood can be crowded and lonely at exactly the same time. People show up for premieres, for parties, for success. But crisis? Crisis gets real quiet. The phone rings less. The invitations slow down. The room gets smaller. And somewhere inside all of this, Harriet Pearl Shapiro, the little girl who spent childhood surviving instability, was still there. Still terrified. Still adapting. Still trying to hold the walls together with tape and determination. Because survival had always been her specialty. Until now. Because according to one interpretation, survival was becoming impossible. The debts had not disappeared. The pressure had not disappeared. The men waiting for money had not disappeared. Now medical bills had entered the equation too. And according to the darker version of events, this is where the trap stopped being financial and became psychological. Because if somebody wanted leverage over Susan Kitt, they no longer needed her career. They no longer needed her reputation. They no longer needed Hollywood. They had Timothy. And if history repeatedly proves one ugly truth, it's this: people who operate in shadow economies understand leverage better than almost anybody. Not because they're smarter, because they study weakness. And according to theories that grew around this case years later, somebody out there may have recognized something immediately. Susan Kitt wasn't protecting money. She wasn't protecting fame. She wasn't protecting image. She was protecting her son. And people will walk into hell for somebody they love. Especially mothers. Especially desperate mothers. Especially people who already spent their entire lives believing security could disappear overnight. And somewhere beyond the cameras, beyond the studio lights, beyond the Hollywood parties, according to one darker interpretation, someone may have already started opening a file. Not on an actress, not on a celebrity, on an asset. And Susan Kitt may not have realized it yet, but somebody had finally found the exact pressure point needed to own her completely. The Meyer-Lansky theory. Now this is where the story takes a hard left turn into territory where history, underworld rumor, speculation, and organized crime mythology begin colliding with each other. Because from this point forward, we move into a darker interpretation of events. Not proven courtroom fact. Not sealed federal files. Not a guy walking into a press conference holding a smoking gun and screaming. Case closed, you animals. Theory. Allegation. Underworld whispers. And according to one of the darkest interpretations surrounding Susan Kitt, someone noticed her vulnerability. That someone? Possibly Meyer-Lansky. Now, for people unfamiliar with the history, Lansky wasn't some street-level guy shaking down corner stores. He was often described as one of the financial architects behind organized crime in 20th century America. Not loud. Not flashy. Not the guy smashing bottles over heads in movies. The accountant. The strategist. The man interested in numbers. Structures. Networks. Money movement. Because violence creates headlines. Accounting creates empires. And according to one theory, Susan Kitt represented something unusually valuable. Not because of who she was, because of what she lacked. Stability. Protection. Options. Because desperate people can become highly controllable people, especially when the pressure points are already exposed. Debt, fear, medical bills, isolation, a child requiring care. And according to this interpretation, the approach wasn't theatrical. No dramatic threats, no movie scene, no guys kicking open doors, yelling in Brooklyn accents. Quite the opposite, clinical, quiet, calculated. Because the most dangerous people in organized crime history often didn't need volume. They needed leverage. According to the theory, Susan's existing debts were allegedly gathered together. bought, consolidated, transferred. Not erased, owned. Because debt has a strange habit. Whoever owns it eventually owns the conversation. And according to the darker version of events, information about Susan's life may have also been assembled. Personal relationships, financial history, private struggles, weaknesses, pressure points. Not because somebody cared. Because information is inventory. And inventory creates control. Most importantly, according to this interpretation, Timothy's medical situation allegedly became part of the equation. And if true, that's where this stops looking like money and starts looking like leverage. Because, according to the theory, Susan wasn't facing a choice between comfort and discomfort. She was facing something much uglier: cooperate or risk watching everything collapse. Her finances, her reputation, her son's care, her entire world. And if you've spent your entire life surviving instability, that isn't a decision. That's psychological warfare. Susan reportedly possessed strong instincts. She had survived childhood, survived Hollywood, survived debt, survived instability. So according to the theory, she resisted, pushed back, threatened, questioned. But here's the ugly thing about systems built around power: they tend to make resistance feel impossible. Because according to underworld lore, Susan eventually received a binary choice: total destruction or service. Not acting, not films, not Hollywood, work, different work, dangerous work. And according to one interpretation, that was the moment Susan Kitt stopped being viewed as a struggling actress, stopped being viewed as a mother, stopped being viewed as a person, and became something else entirely. An asset, a file, a tool, a line item. Because if the darker version of this story is true, Susan Kitt wasn't recruited. She was acquired. And according to the theory, the real nightmare hadn't even started yet. The honey trap years. If the darker interpretation of Susan Kitt's story is accurate, this is where Hollywood ended, and operations began. No more premieres, no more cameras, no more movie posters hanging outside theaters. Because according to the theory, Susan Kitt's transition wasn't gradual, it was immediate, brutal, clinical. One day you're an actress trying to hold together a collapsing life. The next, you're allegedly being moved into a world where information is currency and people become assets. And according to this interpretation, Susan wasn't treated like a star. She was treated like infrastructure, a mechanism, a tool, a very expensive tool. Because according to organized crime lore, intelligence has always been worth more than muscle. Movies teach people that empires are built by guys kicking in doors. History usually says otherwise. Empires survive because somebody knows things. Who's cheating? Who's stealing? Who's lying? Who's moving money? Who's planning betrayal? And according to this theory, Susan Kitt became a collector of information. Not through force, not through threats, through access. Because access opens doors violence never can. According to the interpretation, she was allegedly placed into environments where powerful men relaxed. Casino lounges, private suites, high-stakes parties, penthouse gatherings, rooms where people with enormous money and enormous egos occasionally forgot to shut up. And according to this version of events, Susan received instructions, not acting lessons, extraction lessons: study people, watch behavior, memorize habits, observe weaknesses. Because according to the theory, powerful men often suffer from a very dangerous condition. They love hearing themselves talk, especially after drinking, especially when trying to impress someone, especially when they believe they're in control. And according to underworld folklore, that's where information leaks. Not in meetings, not in boardrooms, afterward, late at night, after the walls come down. Because people who spend their lives projecting power occasionally become careless when they think nobody is watching. And according to one interpretation, Susan's role wasn't simply seduction. Seduction was step one. Step two was listening. Listening carefully, listening while exhausted men bragged, complained, confessed, explained. Because, according to the theory, men with influence sometimes reveal astonishing things while trying to prove how important they are. Business plans, political favors, financial arrangements, private rivalries, offshore accounts, information, more information. And according to this interpretation, Susan allegedly became frighteningly good at it. Because remember, before Hollywood, before movie sets, before organized crime, theories, there was Harriet Pearl Shapiro, the little girl who survived instability by learning to read rooms, read emotions, read people, adapt, watch, listen. And now those survival instincts allegedly had a new purpose, because if this interpretation holds even partial truth, Susan wasn't acting anymore. She was operating. And according to the darker version of events, there was one rule above all others: never write anything down, never keep records, never create evidence. Because according to organized crime logic, paper talks, and paper eventually gets people buried. So if the theory is true, Susan carried everything in the only place nobody expected: her mind. Names, numbers, conversations, secrets, entire maps of invisible worlds stored inside one increasingly exhausted woman. And here's the part where the story starts getting ugly. Because according to this interpretation, every successful operation made Susan more valuable, but it also made her more dangerous. Because information doesn't just create power, sometimes it creates liability. And according to one darker possibility, Susan Kitt wasn't just collecting secrets anymore. She was becoming one. The woman who knew too much. If the darker interpretation of Susan Kitt's story is true, there comes a moment when the operation changes. Not publicly, not dramatically, no alarms. No meeting in a smoke-filled room where somebody announces, "Congratulations, everybody, we created a gigantic problem." No, because the most dangerous transitions happen quietly. And according to this theory, Susan Kitt eventually crossed an invisible line. At first, she was allegedly gathering information. Simple intelligence. Who was meeting who? Who was skimming money? Who was planning expansion? Who was lying? Who was quietly moving pieces around the board? Useful information, valuable information, but manageable. Then the information allegedly got bigger, much bigger. Because according to one interpretation, the casino world of the late 1950s and early 1960s wasn't just gambling. It was infrastructure, power, banks, politicians, corporate alliances, offshore movement, invisible pipelines carrying extraordinary amounts of money. And allegedly, Susan started seeing pieces of that machinery. Not the whole thing, not at first, just fragments. Names, routing numbers, bank contacts, business arrangements, political relationships, loose threads. But enough loose threads eventually become a map. And according to one theory, Susan possessed a dangerous gift: memory. Because writing things down was forbidden. No notebooks, no ledgers, no records, nothing. Everything allegedly had to live inside her head. And according to the story Susan adapted, she remembered conversations, sequences, financial details, patterns, entire networks. Which sounds impressive until you realize something terrifying. A person carrying enough information eventually becomes indistinguishable from evidence. Because according to organized crime logic, information creates two categories: assets and liabilities. Assets stay useful, liabilities become problems. And according to this darker interpretation, Susan slowly began transforming from one into the other. Because every operation allegedly taught her something new, not only about rivals, not only about targets, about everybody, about systems, about methods, about how money disappeared, how power moved, how names stayed hidden. Because once you understand how someone destroys another person's empire, you eventually understand how they built their own. And according to one theory, Susan started recognizing exactly that. The structures, the mechanics, the architecture, the invisible skeleton holding everything together. And that realization allegedly hit with terrifying force. Because according to the darker version of events, Susan understood one brutal rule. People in certain worlds don't retire with secrets. Especially enormous secrets. Not quietly, not comfortably, not forever. Because if your mind becomes a vault eventually, somebody starts wondering who owns the key. And according to the theory, Susan's fear reportedly changed. Before, she feared debt, feared exposure, feared humiliation. Now, according to this interpretation, she allegedly feared becoming unnecessary. Because unnecessary assets create uncomfortable conversations. And uncomfortable conversations inside criminal organizations tend to become permanent. So according to one possibility, Susan began living under a different reality entirely. Not survival. Countdown. Because somewhere beneath the expensive clothes, beneath the glamour, beneath the performance, the actress may have finally realized something horrifying. She wasn't collecting secrets anymore. She had become one. And according to the darker interpretation of the story, vaults don't get freedom. Vaults get monitored. And eventually vaults get emptied. The fortress on Encino Avenue. If that was the moment Susan Kitt realized she had become a vault. This is what happens when a vault becomes terrified. Because according to the darker interpretation of this story, Susan didn't simply disappear from Hollywood. She retreated. And there is a difference. Disappearing suggests escape. Retreat suggests fear. By now, the actress, according to the theory, had allegedly become something much more dangerous than a former B-movie star. She was a living archive. A walking storage unit of names, relationships, financial pathways, whispered conversations, and invisible connections stretching through casinos, executives, politicians, and underworld networks. And if you believe the darker interpretation of events, Susan knew exactly what happened to people who knew too much. So she left. Not with cameras following. Not with dramatic music. Not with newspaper headlines reading, "Former Hollywood star begins new chapter." No. She withdrew behind walls. Literal walls. According to reports surrounding her later years, Susan purchased a large property on Encino Avenue in the San Fernando Valley. And over time, that property allegedly transformed into something that looked less like a home and more like a bunker. Heavy locks, boarded windows, layers of isolation, guard dogs, barriers, defenses. And to outside observers, the image looked tragic. A former actress, a crumbling mansion, newspapers stacked to ceilings, decay, darkness, paranoia. Easy story. Too easy. Because society loves neat explanations. Former star loses career. Former star loses grip on reality. Roll credits. Everybody go home. But according to one darker theory, Susan wasn't simply afraid of imaginary monsters. She allegedly knew monsters personally. Because if you spend years operating in environments built around secrecy and leverage, paranoia starts becoming difficult to separate from survival. And according to this interpretation, every strange behavior had purpose. The windows? Protection. The locks? Protection. The dogs? Protection. The isolation? Protection. Because according to the theory, Susan wasn't hiding from random danger. She was allegedly hiding from people who understood surveillance. People who understood silence. People who understood cleanup. And according to underworld mythology, silence often arrives wearing expensive shoes. But here's the part that starts turning the story into something much sadder. Because while Susan allegedly built defenses against threats outside the house, inside the house sat Timothy, her son. The entire reason this alleged bargain supposedly existed in the first place, because the anonymous money reportedly continued arriving. Quietly. Regularly. Enough to cover medical care. Enough to maintain treatment. Enough to keep the arrangement alive. That money became something horrifying. Not help. Not generosity. A leash. Because every dollar allegedly carried a reminder. You're still owned. You're still connected. You're still inside the system. And according to one interpretation, Susan understood that perfectly. She reportedly sat inside a darkening world surrounded by barriers, dogs, fear, and memories. Watching. Waiting. Listening. Because once you've spent years believing somebody might come through the door, eventually every noise starts sounding like footsteps. The fortress wasn't built to keep the world out. It may have been built because Susan Kitt believed the world was eventually coming in. And somewhere outside those walls, whether real or imagined, she may have believed someone was still watching the house. The audit. Susan had spent years living under one terrifying arrangement. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Stay useful. And the money keeps coming. Not freedom. Not peace. Maintenance. Because according to the theory, the anonymous funds arriving month after month weren't acts of generosity. They weren't retirement payments. They weren't compassion. They were operational expenses. Keep the vault closed. Keep the secrets buried. Keep the assets stable. And according to one interpretation, for years the arrangement worked. Until one thing changed. Meyer Lansky died. And when powerful people die, systems don't disappear. Systems reorganize. New managers arrive. New priorities emerge. New people start opening old files. And according to the darker version of events, that's exactly where Susan Kitt's nightmare allegedly began. Because the people who inherit empires rarely inherit loyalty. They inherit numbers, accounts, risk assessments, liabilities. And according to this theory, somewhere during a financial review, somebody allegedly noticed an unusual recurring expense. Money. Quiet money. Untraceable money. Flowing toward a strange address in Encino, California. So according to the interpretation, somebody pulled records. Old records. Historical records. And eventually they reached Susan Kitt. Not the actress. Not the mother. Not the woman who allegedly helped gather information years earlier. No. Just a line item. A file. An expense. And according to organized crime logic, expenses eventually generate questions. Especially large expenses. Especially old expenses. Especially expenses attached to people who know things. The new people reviewing the books allegedly viewed Susan very differently. Meyer may have seen utility, value, history, investment. The new generation allegedly saw exposure, risk, potential disaster. Susan still possessed information. Old information. Historical information. Names. Networks. Relationships. Methods. The kind of knowledge nobody wants appearing in courtrooms or investigative files decades later. And suddenly the question allegedly changed. No longer. How do we protect the asset? Now. Why are we still paying for it? And according to the darker version of the story, that question terrified Susan. Because if she truly understood the system, then she allegedly understood exactly what audits meant. Audits don't always involve numbers. Sometimes they involve people. Because organizations built around secrecy eventually review vulnerabilities, loose ends, weak links, problems. Susan may have realized something immediately. The money slowing down wasn't a mistake. It wasn't accounting. It wasn't delay. It was communication. A message. And according to the theory, the message allegedly said, "We're looking at you now. The funds reportedly started arriving late, then smaller, then inconsistently. Panic took over. Because if Susan spent years expecting an eventual reckoning, this allegedly looked exactly like the beginning. Because according to underworld logic, nobody sends retirement letters. Nobody sends formal notices. Nobody politely explains. Good evening. Unfortunately, your protection package has expired. No. Silence becomes the message. Susan Kitt understood silence better than anybody. Because somewhere inside that dark house, surrounded by dogs, locked doors, newspapers, and fear, she may have realized something horrifying. The countdown had started. Someone may have finally reopened the vault. The night everything ended. The night of December 10th, 1986 was not random. It was collision. Years of fear. Years of secrecy. Years of paranoia. Years of pressure. All crashing together inside one decaying mansion on Encino Avenue. Because by this point, according to the theory, everything holding Susan's fragile world together had allegedly started collapsing at once. The money was disappearing. The arrangement was failing. The protection was fading. And Timothy, the center of Susan's entire alleged Faustian bargain, was reportedly spiraling into severe physical and psychological instability. According to accounts surrounding the case, his medical treatments had become deeply complicated over the years. Hormone therapies, experimental interventions, psychological volatility, mood swings, isolation. And inside the mansion, the atmosphere allegedly deteriorated into absolute chaos. The house itself sounded like a nightmare. Dark hallways, boarded windows, stacks of newspapers, rotting food, animal waste, aggressive Akita dogs roaming through narrow pathways carved into mountains of clutter. It no longer resembled a Hollywood residence. It resembled collapse. And according to one interpretation, Susan herself was barely holding together mentally. Years of fear. Years of sedatives. Years of paranoia. Years of believing somebody might eventually come through the door. Because according to the darker theory, Susan wasn't simply afraid of dying. She allegedly feared deletion, erasure, cleanup. And then came the night everything snapped. The exact sequence of events remains heavily disputed. Officially, authorities concluded the death resulted from a violent confrontation inside the house involving Timothy Roman. But according to underworld theories surrounding the case, some believe outside manipulation may have pushed the situation toward catastrophe. A phone call. A threat. A deliberate disruption. An intrusion. Nobody knows. And that's where the story becomes dangerous territory. Because from this point forward, the line between documented fact and organized crime speculation becomes extremely thin. What we do know is this. On December 10th, 1986, Susan Kitt died violently inside her bedroom. The weapon was a heavy steel weightlifting bar. And the injuries were catastrophic. Brutal. overwhelming. The emergency call that followed allegedly came from Timothy Roman himself. Hysterical. Panicked. Disoriented. According to reports, he claimed a mysterious intruder dressed in black had entered the house and attacked his mother before fleeing. And immediately, investigators encountered problems with the story. Because according to the official findings, the mansion appeared sealed from the inside. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No damaged doors. No evidence supporting the presence of an outside attacker. And the environment itself reportedly looked almost impossible to navigate quietly. The house was packed floor to ceiling with debris and clutter. Narrow pathways. Darkness. Dogs. Obstacles everywhere. The scene looked less like a clean professional hit, and more like a psychological war zone. Police focused almost immediately on Timothy. The media followed fast, and once the headlines started, the narrative locked into place. Former Hollywood actress. Isolated mansion. Disabled son. Violent tragedy. Case closed. Because the public loves simple explanations, especially tragic ones. Because while the world focused on the horror inside the house, nobody looked beyond it. Nobody asked larger questions. Nobody started tracing old financial pathways. Nobody reopened buried connections to Las Vegas, organized crime, offshore money, or alleged intelligence operations. Everything collapsed inward neatly. Contained. Controlled. Manageable. That may have been the entire point. Because if Susan Kitt truly had become a vault of dangerous information, then the perfect ending wasn't a public execution. It was a domestic tragedy. Something messy enough to look believable. Something sad enough to stop deeper questions. Something chaotic enough to bury decades of alleged secrets underneath tabloid headlines and police reports. By the time the police arrived at the mansion, the cleanup may have already been complete. The official story. Once the police arrived at the Encino mansion, the machine started moving. And once the machine starts moving, history has a funny habit of becoming very selective. Because investigations do not just gather facts. They organize narratives. They create timelines. They build explanations. And according to the official version of events, the explanation here was straightforward. Tragic. Horrific. But straightforward. Susan Kitt, a former Hollywood actress living in extreme isolation, had allegedly been killed during a violent domestic incident involving her son, Timothy Roman. Case closed. Move to the next file. Roll credits. Except stories involving old Hollywood, isolation, mental collapse, and enormous amounts of unanswered questions rarely stay neat for very long. Because the scene itself already looked like something pulled from a psychological horror film. The mansion sat hidden behind walls and overgrowth. The windows were boarded. The rooms were buried beneath mountains of clutter. Aggressive dogs reportedly moved through the property. Darkness sat over everything. To investigators and reporters walking into that environment, The conclusion almost seemed to write itself. Former actress. Years of isolation. Mental deterioration. Family instability. Violence. Tragedy. And the media immediately grabbed hold of it. Because the media loves stories that arrive pre-assembled. And this one practically gift-wrapped itself. The headlines focused on the spectacle. The house. The horror. The bizarre details. The public image quickly hardened a forgotten B-movie actress living in squalor, killed by the very child she spent years trying to protect. Simple. Emotional. Terrible. Understandable. And once the public receives an explanation that emotionally satisfies them, something dangerous happens. People stop asking questions. Because mystery requires work. Tragedy does not. Then came the legal proceedings. And according to the documented case history, Timothy Roman eventually stood trial. But what followed complicated everything. Because the defense reportedly did not focus entirely on denying violence. Instead, attention turned toward Timothy's medical history. Years of severe health struggles. Experimental treatments. Psychological instability. Hormonal interventions. Neurological complications. Experts reportedly testified regarding long-term medical and behavioral effects connected to his condition and treatment history. The argument painted a picture not simply of criminal intent, but of catastrophic dysfunction. A young man with profound medical complications. A deteriorating home environment. A deeply fractured family dynamic. And ultimately, the legal outcome reflected that framing. Not cold calculation. Not conspiracy. Not organized crime. Tragedy. And officially, that's where the story ended. But here's the uncomfortable thing: official conclusions and public curiosity rarely operate the same way. Because official narratives answer questions. Sometimes. But unanswered details have a nasty habit of lingering around the edges. And according to people who later studied the case through a different lens, there were still pieces that felt unfinished. Because while police reportedly looked at Timothy, others kept staring somewhere else. At timing. At circumstances. At silence. At questions. Susan Kitt wasn't simply a forgotten actress. She allegedly spent years operating near worlds built entirely on secrecy. And secrecy has one strange characteristic. Even after a case closes, it occasionally leaves fingerprints. Except fingerprints may have been exactly what was missing. The theory that never died. Officially, the story ended in a courtroom. Officially, the books were closed. Officially, Susan Kitt became another tragic Hollywood headline, filed away into the endless archive of strange Los Angeles stories. Case solved. Everybody go home. Except history has a bad habit. Sometimes it refuses to sit down and shut up. Because for decades after Susan Kitt's death, people looking back at the case kept finding themselves staring at the same uncomfortable question. What if the official explanation wasn't the entire explanation? Now, before we go any further, this matters. This chapter moves fully into interpretation, speculation, and underworld theory. Not proven fact, not court findings, not federal conclusions. Theory. Because according to the darker interpretation surrounding Susan Kitt, certain details allegedly never sat right. Not individually, together. Because strange details alone happen all the time. But enough strange details sitting in the same room eventually start looking like a meeting. According to later discussions surrounding the case, one of the most debated points involved the murder weapon itself, the steel weightlifting bar. Because, according to theories that grew around the case, questions emerged regarding forensic evidence, questions about handling, questions about physical evidence, questions about whether certain details match the image of a sudden explosive act of violence. And according to one interpretation, critics argued that some elements felt strangely controlled for an event supposedly driven entirely by chaos. Again, theory, not conclusion. Because once organized crime enters public imagination, every inconsistency suddenly starts wearing a trench coat and smoking cigarettes under a streetlight. And history teaches caution there, because sometimes people see conspiracies everywhere, but sometimes unanswered questions stay unanswered for reasons people don't like. Then came the timing. Because timing bothered people, Susan allegedly spent years existing under a strange financial arrangement, quiet money, regular support, anonymous assistance. And according to the theory, disruptions to that arrangement supposedly happened close to the collapse surrounding her final years. Now, by itself, means nothing. People lose money, circumstances change, life falls apart. But according to underworld theorists, timing becomes suspicious when viewed beside everything else: the alleged history, the fear, the paranoia, the isolation, the threats, the supposed knowledge. And the central question returned: what exactly did Susan Kitt know? If Susan really had spent years hearing conversations, observing relationships, and remembering names, she allegedly represented something dangerous. Not physically dangerous, informationally dangerous. A vault. Again, that word keeps returning. Vault. Because according to organized crime mythology, the problem with vaults is simple: they eventually create anxiety. Who controls them? Who accesses them? Who protects them? And what happens if they suddenly open? So according to the darkest theory of Susan Kitt's story, the tragedy inside the Encino mansion was not random, not entirely, not directly, but strategically. The theory argues that no dramatic team of assassins was necessary. No car bombs, no movie scene, no trench coats, no silenced pistols, just pressure, manipulation, environment, stress. If a system already sits on the edge of collapse, you don't need to push very hard. You simply remove support and let gravity finish the job. Again, theory, not proof. But the reason the theory never disappeared is simple. It explains something emotionally satisfying. People struggle with chaos. People struggle with meaningless tragedy. We want architecture, patterns, reasons, villains. Because randomness feels cruel, but design feels understandable. And decades later, Susan Kitt still sits somewhere in the strange intersection between Hollywood mythology, organized crime folklore, and true crime obsession. Officially, a tragic family catastrophe. Unofficially, something stranger, something darker, something people still argue about. Because whether Susan Kitt was an isolated woman consumed by fear, or whether she became trapped inside forces larger than herself, one thing remains undeniable: the story never really died. It just changed forms, and somewhere in the distance, old Hollywood keeps doing what old Hollywood always does: keeping secrets. Morale. The bill always arrives. Maybe that's the ugliest part of this story. Not the mansion. not the steel bar, not even the blood. It's the transaction. Because whether you believe the official version or the darker theory, Susan Kitt's life became a series of bargains. And history is full of bargains that look reasonable in the beginning. Just one compromise. Just one favor. Just one decision. Just one shortcut. Just one person saying, "Trust me." Then 20 years later, you wake up wondering how the hell you got here. Because power almost never introduces itself honestly. It doesn't walk into a room wearing a sign that says, "Hello, I'm here to destroy your life." No. Power shows up smiling, offering help, offering protection, offering solutions, offering exactly what hurts people most: relief. And according to the darker interpretation of Susan Kitt's story, every step looked understandable while it was happening. Debt. Fear. Medical bills. Desperation. A mother trying to save her child. Because people don't usually walk into darkness because they're evil. They walk into darkness because they think they found the exit. And whether the underworld theory is true or not, one lesson keeps showing up throughout history. Systems built entirely around leverage eventually consume everybody inside them. Everybody. The operators. The soldiers. The bosses. The accountants. The people collecting information. And the people becoming information. Because secrets create power. But secrets also create prisons. And prisons don't always have bars. Sometimes they have mansions. Sometimes they have bank accounts. Sometimes they have contracts. Sometimes they have silence. And maybe Susan Kitt spent years believing survival meant outrunning the past. But history keeps teaching the same brutal lesson. The past rarely runs. It waits. And eventually, it sends the bill. Susan Kitt became remembered for the ending. The mansion. The tragedy. The headlines. The horror. But maybe the ending wasn't the whole story. Maybe somewhere beneath the newspaper stacks, locked gates, and sensational headlines sat something much sadder. A woman who spent her entire life trying to find safety. Trying to find stability. Trying to find a place where nobody could take everything away. And whether she was a victim of circumstance, a victim of isolation, or, according to some darker interpretations, a victim of forces much larger than herself, the result looked the same. Fear. Silence. And loss. Because old Hollywood built dreams. The underworld built empires. And both had a habit of using people until there was nothing left. If you enjoy documentaries involving old Hollywood mysteries, organized crime history, strange true crime, internet anthropology, and stories that make you stare at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, wondering what the hell just happened, subscribe to Pizzaverse Studios. Because around here we don't just tell stories. We go digging through the walls looking for what got buried. To everybody hanging out in the Pizzaverse, thank you. Seriously. Out of all the channels, documentaries, live streams, rabbit holes, conspiracy boards, and internet madness, you ended up here with us. That means something. To the longtime crew. Your family. To the new people. Welcome to the chaos. Grab a chair. Grab a coffee. Maybe lock your doors after this one. And remember, history gets weird. People get weirder. And the stories they leave behind, sometimes they're stranger than fiction. We'll see you next time. This is the Pizzaverse. And we don't rewrite history. We excavate it. Susan Kitt. Former B-movie actress with enough mystery around her life to keep true crime people awake at 2:13 a.m. Hollywood sold glamour. Susan's story allegedly came with paranoia, secrecy, and enough unanswered questions to fill a warehouse of corkboards and red string. Meyer Lansky. The accountant mob movies always forget to make terrifying enough. While everybody else wanted headlines and drama, Lansky allegedly treated criminal empires like spreadsheets with body counts. Somewhere, a calculator probably feared this guy. Timothy Roman. The most tragic figure in the entire story. A life surrounded by illness, isolation, controversy, and theories that still spark arguments decades later. Depending on who you ask, he's either at the center of a heartbreaking family collapse or standing in the middle of a mystery much larger than himself. The Encino Mansion. Not a house, not a home. By the end, this place sounded like if paranoia, old Hollywood, locked doors, newspapers, and a horror movie all moved in together and stopped paying rent. Even the house looked like it needed therapy.
You tired? Emotionally exhausted? Sitting there watching calm creators with stable blood pressure and reasonable reactions? Disgusting. You need Meltdown Energy. The first energy drink scientifically engineered for live stream chaos. Emotional overreaction. Dramatic exits. And yelling at strangers in real time. Every can of Meltdown Energy is packed with 900 milligrams of emotional instability. Artificial rage flavoring. Zero self-awareness. And enough caffeine to argue with 3 chat rooms simultaneously. Side effects may include screaming at comments, accidental live streams at 3 a.m., deleting friends publicly, and yelling, "I'm done," before returning 14 minutes later. But wait, there's more. Introducing the all-new Livestream Chaos Booster. Now within instant emotional amplification, audience dependency technology, and our patented no-filter reaction system. Why think before speaking when you can emotionally detonate immediately? Other drinks help you focus. Meltdown Energy helps you start internet wars over absolutely nothing. But wait, there's more for you emotional train wrecks. For a limited time only, every purchase of Meltdown Energy comes with Free comment section, paranoia. That's right, pal. Now, every harmless comment instantly feels like betrayal, disrespect, a coordinated conspiracy, or a direct personal attack from the internet mafia. Somebody says, hope you're okay. Boom. 3-hour live stream, 12 community posts, 47 block subscribers, whole family crying in the kitchen. Meltdown energy, don't believe in therapy, self-awareness, emotional regulation, taking a walk and cooling off like a normal human being. Nah, this is pure unfiltered algorithm-fueled meltdown energy. Side effects may include rage posting at 3 a.m., live stream instability, dramatic exits from YouTube, dramatic returns to YouTube, dramatic return to the dramatic returns, excessive blocking, internet paranoia, arguing with profile pictures, believing every emoji is shade, severe attention dependency, do not consume while emotionally stable. Seriously, this product was not designed for peaceful people. Meltdown energy. Because calm people don't go viral.
I've gotta keep the calm before the storm. I don't want less, I don't want more. Must bar the windows and the doors to keep me safe, to keep me warm. Yeah, my life is what I'm fighting for. Can't part the sea, can't reach the shore. And my voice becomes the driving force. I won't let this pull me overboard. God, keep my head above water, don't let me drown. It gets harder, I'll meet you there at the altar as I fall down to my knees. Don't let me drown, drown, drown. Don't let me drown. So pull me up from down below, 'cause I'm underneath the undertow. Come dry me off and hold me close. I need you now, I need you most. God, keep my